Sometimes you come across perspectives that really make you reconsider what you think you know.
Definitely.
Today, we're diving into one of those. You sent us some fascinating material, and, well, it hints at layers of reality, maybe far beyond the everyday.
Indeed. The source you provided offers a rather unique way of looking at a technology that's already the subject of much speculation. HARP.
Right.
It's the kind of material that really encourages us to explore interpretations outside the, let's say, the mainstream view.
That's for sure. We're looking at excerpts from a YouTube video transcript. It details a session involving, okay, get this, what's described as an external human operator, Iulia Ipati, and a support telepath, Claudia. They're using something called the Grifasi Method.
And their focus.
Their focus is Claudia's perceptions and visualizations, specifically connected to HARP. Now, look, we're not here to scientifically prove or disprove any of this. That's not the goal.
No, absolutely not.
Our aim is simply to explore what Claudia perceives and the potential insights, however unconventional they might seem, that these perceptions might offer to you, the listener.
Exactly. Think of it as examining a very specific, maybe even imaginative understanding of HARP's possible purposes and impacts as presented in this one source.
It's about understanding the narratives presented here, identifying the themes, the patterns within this particular viewpoint, just laying it out for you.
Precisely.
Okay, let's start with Claudia's initial impression of HARP. What does she see first?
Well, she immediately visualizes a very complex structure, that's the phrase used, full of pillars, wires, and interconnected pieces and constructs.
Sounds almost like a massive, intricate machine.
Yes, and what's notable here is the strong sense of advanced technology that she feels is inherently linked to energy. She mentions a metal color, but the real emphasis is on this powerful vibration.
Vibrate.
An energy that vibrates really strong, is how she puts it, and it fluctuates in intensity. This resonates, in a way, with HARP's actual function, involving high-frequency radio waves.
Right, that makes sense. And she really emphasizes the scale, doesn't she? Describing it as quite huge.
Oh, yeah. It's not a small-scale operation in her mind's eye. It's vast, a vast undertaking, at least in her visualization.
Okay, so a huge, energetic, complex structure. What does she perceive as the intended goals of this program? This is where things get really intriguing.
The initial imagery Claudia receives is quite striking. She sees a person being pushed by an incredibly strong wind, followed quickly by red flames, then raindrops, and finally a dry desert landscape under a powerful sun.
Wow, that's a rapid sequence. Wind, fire, rain, drought. It paints a picture of HARP as a tool with the capacity to dramatically alter weather patterns in diverse ways.
Exactly. So for you, the breadth of potential environmental control attributed to HARP in this view is quite significant.
And she feels there's more to it than just that.
Yes. The feeling she gets is that there are even more than that, multiple objectives or purposes at play. Then another image emerges. Flooding in a city.
Flooding now?
Yes, accompanied by terrestrial movements that she associates with a possible tornado, and interestingly, an underground influence.
Underground influence linked to a tornado. That's a connection you don't often hear in mainstream discussions about weather phenomena.
No, it certainly makes you wonder about the perceived scope of this technology within this interpretation. It raises questions about the reach, the interconnectedness of these phenomena in this framework.
And she mentioned something specific. A past event.
And then, she mentions a past event possibly connected to someone or something called Dana and a catastrophic flooding. The details are unclear, but the association with a major weather disaster is evident.
It's interesting how a name, even without specifics, can trigger such a strong connection in her visualization. Okay, so the transcript moves on to future projections, starting with 2025. Apparently, some HARP-related projects are perceived as, expiring this year? What does Claudia pick up on regarding this?
She gets a strong sense of an ending for some programs, yes, but it's not painted as a simple conclusion. There's a feeling of a bigger effect tied to this ending.
A bigger effect.
And the imagery of flames reappears.
Flames again. That seems to be a recurring symbol associated with significant HARP activity in her perception.
It does. So the recurrence of flames seems to be a significant indicator for you to note. And alongside the flames, she anticipates tectonic movements, earthquakes, and shocking surprises of catastrophic magnitude being prepared and potentially triggered.
Earthquakes linked to the end of HARP programs. That's a pretty dramatic prediction.
It is. And she emphasizes, importantly, that these events aren't entirely certain. They require specific conditions to be met. which suggests, in this view, an intentional effort to impose these events on reality.
Impose them. So it's not just about observing natural events. It's about actively trying to cause these major events, at least according to this perception.
That's the implication, yes. A level of deliberate manipulation beyond natural occurrences.
Okay, now let's fast forward 5 years, 2030. What does Claudia visualize for the next phase of HARP projects?
The primary image for 2030 is one of severe droughts, expanding to more areas globally than we currently see.
Droughts again. That aligns with the earlier visualization of a desert landscape. So a continued focus on manipulating water resources, it seems.
Exactly. So for you, the initial idea of HARP influencing rainfall and causing droughts appears to intensify in this future projection.
And the winds are still part of it.
Yes, she reiterates the perception of strong winds as a contributing factor to these increased droughts. But it's not solely about the weather by 2030. She also perceives a more direct impact on human beings.
Oh.
In what way? She senses not pleasant vibrations negatively influencing humans, potentially through frequencies.
Frequencies.
Yeah.
That makes sense, given the nature of HARP's technology involving radio waves.
Right. This idea of harmful frequencies affecting human health is a recurring theme in discussions around these kinds of technologies. Alternative theories often propose specific mechanisms, which is maybe something for you to look into if you're interested.
But there's something else she mentions that's quite unsettling, isn't there?
Right.
About substances.
Indeed. This is quite disturbing. She has an image of substances being included in shots, injections, treatments, medicines, and even chemical traces in the air. Wow. This suggests, in her view, a long-term, multi-pronged agenda that extends way beyond just environmental manipulation.
It paints a picture of a deliberate, widespread introduction of substances into the human population and the perceived link to HARP in 2030. How does that work?
The idea presented is that by 2030, the cumulative effects of these substances on human physiology will make individuals more susceptible to the influence of HARP's frequencies.
So like prepping the population to be more effective.
That's the viewpoint presented here, yes.
Yeah.
A potential synergy between different methods of influence. It's a rather unsettling thought for you to consider.
Absolutely. Okay, let's delve into the perceived effects on the mental body. This is where the visualization gets very specific, almost biological.
Yes, it does. Claudia visualizes HARP radiation creating little pores, little breaks, and little holes in the human brain at a microscopic level.
Little holes in the brain.
The imagery is quite vivid, suggesting a physical disruption of brain tissue in her perception.
And what are the perceived consequences of these microscopic breaks? What's the supposed effect?
Well, she describes this as disrupting the connections between brain cells, the synapses and neurons.
Right.
This disruption, in turn, is perceived to reduce the ability for long, rational patterns of thought. It decreases complex reasoning, stifles creativity, potentially leading to a more, quote, simple state of mind for those affected.
So the intended outcome, according to this perception, is a kind of cognitive impairment, dulling the population.
That's the implication within this narrative. And she even suggests that more severe exposure could lead to a vegetative state in highly affected individuals.
Weird.
Depending on the radiation levels and individual vulnerabilities, of course. It's a stark and concerning vision of potential neurological damage as perceived by Claudia.
It certainly is. Okay, now let's shift gears a bit, move into the more metaphysical aspects of her perceptions. What does Claudia detect on this level regarding HARP?
Okay. Initially, she sees little sparks of negative light, not natural light. She feels these are inverting the normal energy flow in the air, directing it technologically.
Negative light, so like an artificial energy.
You could think of this false light in her visualization as almost like an artificial overlay on the natural energetic environment, creating space, perhaps, for the energy from the HARP technology to propagate more easily.
So it's like disrupting the natural energetic environment to facilitate the program's influence.
Exactly. And she also perceives larger structures in the metaphysical plane. These are connected to these false light sparks and, in turn, linked to the physical HARP structures on Earth.
Metaphysical structures linked to the physical ones.
Yes, and these metaphysical structures are seen as operating both upwards and downwards, extending into the underground, but in a metaphysical sense.
Wow. So a multi-dimensional operation in this view, then. Not limited to just the physical tech we know about.
Precisely. And the overarching feeling she gets is that this entire construct, both physical and metaphysical, is managed and directed by sentient beings or entities.
Entities.
Yeah.
Involved in running HARP at a metaphysical level. Okay, that takes us into a whole other realm of understanding. What can Claudia perceive about these entities?
Well, she first describes a very high reptiloid-like entity. Brown, tall, arrogant is the description, operating at a high management level, overseeing parts of the project.
A reptilian figure in management. That does align with some of the more esoteric theories out there. Is this entity doing the work?
No, not directly doing the work, more in a supervisory role. This recurring theme of reptilian figures in control roles is pretty prevalent in certain alternative narratives, as you probably know.
Right. What other types of entities does she perceive?
She also sees a blonde, cold, very technological, and extremely intelligent humanoid figure.
Humanoid. Different from the reptiloid.
Very different. This being is associated with the actual creation of the project and is described as modulating its heartbeat, whatever that means in this context. Maybe its core frequency or function.
So a technical architect, perhaps.
Yeah.
With a different demeanor than the reptilian manager.
Yes, exactly. The reptiloid is perceived as being involved in applying the project, attracting scientists possibly through less than ethical means like blackmail or appealing to fame or money.
Okay.
The humanoid, on the other hand, seems more focused on the foundational aspects, the ongoing regulation of the project's core functions.
It's like a division of labor, almost. Different types handling different aspects.
Yeah.
Is there a hierarchy between them that Claudia perceives?
Well, the reptiloid is seen as a manager or supervisor, but no entity is perceived as being above it within that reptiloid group.
Okay.
Similarly, the humanoid is at the highest level within its own group. There isn't a clear indication of one type being unilaterally in charge of the other. It suggests maybe two separate but collaborating or maybe competing groups.
Interesting. The transcript mentions something about the reptiloid managers rotating. Why would they do that?
Yes, Claudia perceives that these reptiloid managers rotate approximately every 3 years.
3 years.
The reason given is an awareness of their own limitations specifically, a tendency towards repetitive patterns. They need to bring in new ideas, apparently, to overcome potential vulnerabilities in their approach.
Huh. That's a surprisingly self-aware approach, if that's how it functions. Recognizing and trying to mitigate their own biases. What about the humanoid architect? Does that one rotate too?
No, the humanoid architect is not seen to rotate.
Why not?
This is attributed to them being more creative, possessing a more complex intellect, and having a significantly longer lifespan with sustained cognitive function.
A longer lifespan tied to superior intellect and creativity.
Yes.
That's a major difference. And the perceived reason for this longer lifespan?
It's attributed to superior genetics with fewer oppressed genes. This is contrasted with a perceived blackness or inactivation within the human genome. So it's almost a commentary on human genetic potential within this visualization.
A commentary on human potential. Interesting. Now let's talk about the origins and goals of this whole perceived project. When and why did it supposedly start?
According to the perception, the project started on the metaphysical level, before any human involvement.
Before humans?
Yes, with the initial goal of influencing and manipulating human life. HARP, in this view, is seen as a project initiated by these entities and then implemented on humans with the help of recruited scientists.
So humans are perceived as instruments, basically. Tools in a plan that originated elsewhere.
That's the idea presented, yes.
And what is the ultimate goal of this manipulation? According to Claudia's perceptions, what are they trying to achieve?
The ultimate goal is perceived as implementing a complex agenda detrimental to humankind. This includes modifying weather conditions to support what are described as hoaxes, like global warming, which is seen here as a manufactured narrative.
Global warming as a hoax facilitated by weather manipulation. Okay, that's a common thread in certain alternative narratives. What do the entities supposedly gain from all of this disruption and manipulation?
The perceived benefits for these entities involve generating human suffering, chaos, sadness, depression, and scarcity.
Suffering. Why?
These negative emotions and conditions are believed to create low frequencies that the entities allegedly need as a form of sustenance or energy. This idea of entities feeding off negative human energy is a recurring theme in some metaphysical beliefs, something for you to consider.
They feed off our negative energy. That's
yeah,
that's a concept you hear.
Yeah.
And the extreme end of this goal, what's the worst case scenario envisioned?
The extreme vision described is transforming Earth into widespread poverty, resembling favelas, where people live with minimal resources, just enough to sustain constant suffering.
So they need the suffering, not necessarily our extermination.
Apparently. A world mired in misery as an energy source. It's a bleak outlook, certainly.
Very bleak. So how are these entities doing with their plans so far? Are they succeeding?
Well, interestingly, Claudia perceives that humanity is actually doing better than the entity's desire. Our energy quality, apparently, is not as satisfactory to them as they had hoped.
Really? So there's a perceived level of human resilience that's hindering their plans.
That's the implication. It suggests we're not quite the energy source they planned on. As a result, the entities are seen as becoming more desperate.
Desperate.
Yes, desperate to enhance their technology and achieve greater results precisely because people are waking up, in her words, and resisting their manipulations. This idea of a collective awakening is also a common theme in these kinds of counter-narratives for you.
Right, the Great Awakening idea.
Hmm?
What's the potential consequence if this resistance continues, according to this view?
The image Claudia receives is of the entities being left alone in their projects if people withdraw their energy.
Withdraw energy? How?
It seems linked to consciousness, emotional state. If humans collectively shift, it leads to a lack of food and energy supply for them, potentially causing their demise or disappearance.
So our collective consciousness and emotional state have a direct impact on these entities, according to this perspective. That's quite a thought. However, there's a catch, isn't there? A balance.
Yes, exactly. A balance or duality is perceived, preventing either side from easily overpowering the other. The matrix, as it's referred to in the source, continues to function. This suggests a level of ongoing equilibrium, perhaps, in this struggle.
A constant push and pull between these forces. Okay. Now let's talk about the underground connections related to HARP that Claudia perceives. You mentioned that earlier.
Right. She visualizes thunders or fleshlights, interesting term, going deep underground.
Fleshlights.
Yes. Sending vibrations to distant locations to potentially create earthquakes. This reinforces the earlier idea of HARP's influence extending beneath the surface for you.
So the surface structures, the antennas we see pictures of, aren't the only part of this technology. There's a subterranean component. How deep do these underground structures supposedly go?
The feeling she gets is that the actual physical depth isn't as crucial as the technology they contain. It's the mechanisms, the energy they emit, that's important for their function.
It's about the capability, not just the depth.
Precisely. The capability, not just the physical placement. And there are also surface elements involved, right? Not just antennas.
Yes. She mentioned surface elements like curtains that are perceived to emit particles as part of the technology.
Curtains emitting particles. Okay, so it's a system with components both above and below ground working together.
And these underground structures, are they all the same or do they vary?
They are seen as adaptable to the local terrain. The underground structures and the technology within them are adjusted to fit the specific geological characteristics of the area where they're located.
So suggesting a kind of localized customization of the technology.
Exactly.
How many major underground structures does Claudia estimate there are?
She gets the number 9. 9 major underground structures, but with the caveat that there are potentially more, maybe less significant ones.
9 main ones.
The 9 are perceived as the primary, more powerful installations. So what's visualized is a network of significant underground bases connected to the surface HARP facilities.
A whole network. Now, is there any way to prevent this structure from working, according to her perceptions? Can it be stopped or counteracted?
Well, the image she gets isn't exactly about prevention in a simple sense, but more about influence. She feels that conditions on the surface can affect HARP's effectiveness.
Conditions like what?
Human emotions and energy, for one. Also, weather patterns and even the presence of certain metals underground.
So the environment and even our own internal states can potentially play a role in how this technology operates in this view. What about more direct methods of counteracting HARP? Anything technological?
She does visualize a technological reversal process and also a massive metaphysical dome.
A dome?
Yes, a metaphysical one that could prevent HARP's effects over an entire country. This dome is described as being more on a metaphysical level, so not easily observable physically.
A kind of energetic shield.
Yeah.
Does she think this type of protection actually exists already?
She has the feeling that frequency-based protection might already exist, and that it might be applied by certain governments, and maybe even by the entities themselves to protect their own operations.
Protecting their own stuff.
Yeah.
So suggesting a kind of technological arms race, maybe. Offensive and defensive capabilities in play.
That seems to be the implication, yes. A complex situation with different players using similar underlying principles for different ends.
Are any specific protected countries identified in her perception?
No specific countries are named. The need for secrecy around such protection is emphasized as the likely reason for this lack of specific information in her visualization.
Which would make sense, right? If such technology existed, you wouldn't advertise it.
Exactly. It would be closely guarded.
Who does she perceive as being involved in developing and using these technologies, both the harmful applications and the potentially protective ones?
Governments and scientists, as the phrase used. They are perceived as being involved on both sides of the coin, suggesting a complex interplay between different actors and agendas for you. It's not presented as just one monolithic entity controlling everything.
Right. Different factions, different interests at play. Okay, let's quickly revisit the idea of drought implementation. How does Claudia perceive HARP being used specifically to create these dry conditions?
She reiterates the role of strong, dry winds, as mentioned before. But more interestingly, perhaps, she perceives underground water sources being manipulated by HARP vibrations.
Manipulating groundwater. How?
By altering their natural flow. This leads to dryness in some areas, while causing water accumulation, potentially flooding, elsewhere. So it's not just about atmospheric manipulation, it's also about disrupting the natural underground water systems, in her view.
Okay, so direct manipulation of water tables, essentially. Now, let's consider an alternative reality for a moment. What does Claudia visualize a world without HARP being like? Would everything be perfect?
Well, her vision of a world without HARP is different from what she initially expected. While it would be, in her words, more natural and beautiful, she still perceives weather conditions and natural cycles occurring.
So it doesn't mean no storms or climate shifts at all?
No. This suggests that HARP isn't seen as the sole cause of all environmental changes. Natural climate variations would still exist.
What about the current issue of global warming in that HARP-free world scenario?
The feeling is that natural global warming would still exist, but at a slower, more manageable rate for humans. She perceives the entities as exaggerating their control over all weather phenomena.
Okay. So in this perception, HARP is seen more as an accelerant and amplifier of existing natural trends, rather than the sole initiator of all environmental changes.
That seems to be the idea presented, yes. Making things worse, faster, and perhaps directing them.
Right. Now let's connect HARP to specific past events, according to Claudia's perceptions. This is where it gets quite specific and controversial.
Yes. She has affirmative perceptions, meaning she feels a connection to HARP and the 2010 Haiti earthquake.
Haiti, okay.
As well as other earthquakes and catastrophic events, suggesting some of these might have been experiments, actually. Tests of the technology's power.
Earthquakes being used as tests.
Yeah.
That's a chilling thought to consider. What other events does she link to HARP? Any more recent ones?
She perceives connections to the 2023 Lahaina Maui fires.
The Maui fires.
Yes. Also the Turkey earthquake from last year, the major one.
Yeah.
And going back further, the 2013 Oklahoma tornado.
Tornadoes, too.
Apparently. And even chemtrails are mentioned again here, as seen as a complementary technology working in conjunction with HARP.
Chemtrails as part of the same agenda. That's another common theme in alternative theories, like you said. For you listening, this connection is frequently made in these circles. What about the idea of portable HARP devices? Is that something she perceives?
Yes, she perceives the existence of portable HARP devices. And while they may not be as powerful as the big, fixed installations, she feels they can still cause significant harm.
Portable devices capable of causing major damage. That raises serious concerns about their potential use, if they exist.
Absolutely. Easier to deploy, perhaps harder to detect.
What about the Dana flooding we mentioned earlier? Does she connect that to a specific event, like the Valencia floods?
Yes, she perceives a connection between HARP and that Dana flooding event, potentially related to the Valencia floods from last year. And she visualizes the use of both stable, fixed installations and portable units in that event.
Both used together. A combination of fixed and mobile technology in a single event. That's an interesting detail in her visualization.
It is.
What does she perceive about the portable unit used in the Valencia floods? Any details?
It's visualized as large, rectangular, and associated with water, possibly operating in water or using water as some kind of medium or conduit.
Interesting. And the perceived goal? Just weather modification?
No, the perceived goal of the Valencia floods specifically involves politics and causing panic. So the flooding wasn't just about environmental manipulation, it had a political objective as well, according to this perception.
A political motive. Okay. What about even more recent earthquakes, like the ones in the Philippines and China fairly recently, Any HARP connection perceived there?
For the recent Philippines earthquake linked to something called Project Harpoon in some circles and the recent China earthquake, she perceives influence, but not a direct sole cause connection.
Influence, not cause.
Right, suggesting maybe a combination of HARP effects exacerbating or triggering natural conditions that were already present.
So HARP might be pushing things over the edge, rather than being the sole cause in these specific instances, in her view.
That seems to be the perception, and there's another layer to these latest two. These latest two earthquakes are speculatively linked, in her perception, to the entities trying to impress or warn each other.
Wait, the entities using earthquakes to send messages to each other?
Indicating internal power struggles within these groups. That's the speculation offered in the source.
Power struggles among the entities themselves, playing out through geological events. Wow. That's a novel interpretation for you to consider.
It certainly is.
Okay, let's go back to the entities and their control structure for a minute. What's the dynamic perceived between the purely energetic entities and the ones that might be physically assisted, say, by human military groups?
She perceives both energetic and physically assisted entities, potentially human or military collaborators, as being involved. They cooperate at times, apparently, but there are underlying power struggles.
And the two main types, the reptiloid and the humanoid, are still seen as the top players.
Yes, those two primary entity types are perceived as currently having the most control over the planet.
But the balance of power seems to be shifting, you said, according to her perception.
Yes, she gets the feeling that the reptiloid entities are losing power. Becoming smaller is the word used, potentially being overtaken by the humanoid entities.
The humanoids are taking over.
Potentially. Although the humanoids are also perceived as somewhat weakened compared to perhaps their peak described as smaller, having weaker substance.
So a potential changing of the guard at the metaphysical level, but maybe both sides are diminished somehow. That seems to be occurring in this visualization.
That's the picture painted, yes, a complex dynamic.
And there's a connection she makes between these humanoid entities and, well, a well-known concept in spiritual circles, isn't there?
Yes, this is quite pointed. She perceives a connection between these humanoid entities and the Galactic Federation of Light.
Really? The Galactic Federation?
Suggesting they might actually be the same group attempting control, but using spiritual beliefs pretending to help humanity as a cover.
Wow. The Galactic Federation of Light as a potentially manipulative force.
Yeah.
That's a controversial perspective within some spiritual communities for you to note.
Highly controversial, yes. It flips a common narrative on its head.
Okay. Let's shift now to the perceived health impacts of HARP. This is obviously a major concern. What connections does Claudia make here?
Unfortunately, yes, she perceives a connection between HARP and various types of cancer.
Cancer. That's a deeply concerning potential consequence to consider.
It is.
Are any specific cancers mentioned, or just generally?
Specific cancers are mentioned, including thyroid cancer, brain cancer, particularly in the frontal upper part of the brain, liver cancer, and skin cancer, among potentially many others.
That's quite a list. Thyroid, brain, liver, skin.
Yes. This aligns to some extent with existing public concerns about the biological effects of long-term exposure to certain types of electromagnetic radiation, although, of course, mainstream science has its own established perspectives and thresholds regarding harm.
Right. But in her visualization, it's a wide range of serious illnesses potentially linked to this technology. So given these perceived negative effects, the cognitive issues, the cancers, the frequency manipulation, what does Claudia suggest as ways to minimize them? How can people protect themselves, according to this source?
The emphasis is heavily on holistic and natural health practices.
Okay, like what?
Things like avoiding conventional drugs and processed foods, prioritizing natural whole foods, engaging in regular physical activity, even simple walking is mentioned as beneficial.
So basically strengthening the body's natural systems.
Right.
A return to natural living is seen as a form of defense in this view.
Exactly. Boosting overall health and resilience.
What else does she recommend?
The importance of long, good quality sleep is highlighted. That's crucial for recovery. Also, sharpening one's intuition to better discern what practices are genuinely beneficial for you individually.
Listening to your own body and inner guidance makes sense.
And she also mentions the benefit of grounding, walking barefoot on the earth.
Grounding, how does that supposedly help?
For temporarily releasing negative energies, apparently. Discharging buildup.
Interesting. What about spending time in nature generally?
Yes, very important. Spending time in nature, especially near water, rivers, seas, and interacting with animals are seen as beneficial for cleansing and overall well-being. Water and nature as purifiers.
Okay. Any caveats?
Well, she does advise caution regarding sun exposure, noting individual differences and the potential for both natural and potentially HARP-related skin issues, so it's not a one-size-fits-all recommendation there.
Right. So summing up the protection side, a holistic approach. Diet, lifestyle, sleep, intuition, grounding, nature connection, all seen as key to mitigating potential harm as perceived in this source.
Exactly. It's about strengthening the body's natural resilience and reducing susceptibility to negative influences as perceived in this particular visualization.
Well, this has been quite the deep dive into a very, very unconventional perspective on HARP and related phenomena. Let's try to briefly summarize some of the key takeaways from Claudia's visualizations for you, our listener.
Okay. We've explored her perception of HARP as this vast, complex structure. Alleged goals including manipulating weather wind, fire, rain, drought, potentially linked to underground influences, even tectonic movements.
Right, the future projections, 2025 and 2030, suggesting intensified efforts, catastrophic events, and even substances in medicine and the air, prepping people for frequency effects.
Yes. Then the perceived effects on the mental body, those microscopic holes in the brain, leading to cognitive impairment.
And moving into the metaphysical, the idea of manipulation by non-human entities, reptiloid managers, humanoid architects with this long-term agenda based on human suffering for energy.
We also touched on the perceived connections to specific past and recent catastrophic events like Haiti, Maui, Turkey, Valencia, the idea of portable HARP devices.
And potential methods of protection, like metaphysical domes or frequency shields, and the emphasis on natural health and grounding for mitigation.
It's a lot to take in.
It really is. Yeah. And considering these rather extraordinary perceptions presented in the source, you have to wonder, perhaps, what other seemingly unexplained phenomena out there might warrant a closer look, even if it's through unconventional lenses like this one.
It's a valid question. If even a fraction of these visualizations were to reflect some hidden layer of reality, what are the implications for our understanding of the world and maybe the forces at play around us?
It certainly prompts us to consider different perspectives, doesn't it? And the potential for realities maybe beyond our current scientific grasp. Something for you to continue contemplating.
Indeed.
Well, thank you for joining me on this deep dive into some truly thought-provoking material.
My pleasure. It was fascinating to dissect.
Yeah, thank you especially to you, our listener, for providing such an intriguing source and for venturing into these, let's say, uncharted waters with us. We invite you to continue exploring these complex topics with an open yet always discerning mind.